Hey guys, it's Thorn. This is partially a video response and partially just I was thinking about this particular video that I watched this morning, and then my thoughts kind of went to a different place, and it started getting more complicated, and I wanted to kind of go ahead and try to tackle at least part of it before it got out of hand. Um, anyway, sorry, I'm gonna butcher your name. Okay, sorry, but the video response was to Aoifeunderland, Aoifeunderland. I'm gonna link her below. Her videos are cool, so you guys should check her out if you haven't. But this morning she posted a video just sort of generally asking people about voodoo. She said that she'd been reading about it and watching YouTube videos and watching documentaries and stuff like that, and how it always kind of been this maybe kind of a low-grade interest in her life, and she just sort of been coming to the fore reading about it. And she brought up the issue of animal sacrifice. And animal sacrifice, I've mentioned it I think in a couple of videos before. Animal sacrifice is one of those issues in the wider pagan community. And I want to establish here that when I use the phrase pagan community, this does not necessarily include a group like voodoo or any Afro-Caribbean tradition. I think that's very problematic to lump that in. These groups are not neo-pagan, etc. But the subject of animal sacrifice is something that a lot of people don't like to talk about. And I wanted to essentially make 2 points and hopefully try to stay on topic. You guys might have noticed I'm not a note taker. I don't generally read off of things. Sometimes I make notes and then I ignore them, but I'm just gonna go with this one. 2 main points around animal sacrifice that I wanted to raise. The first, and this is the one that was addressed, both of these issues kind of come up, if not in the video that she posted, then in some of the comments. But the main issue that she talked about had to do with animal rights and the violation of those rights, etc. And basically, she has a problem on some level with this idea of animal sacrifice. She said she didn't feel it was necessary, and et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of you can envision where, and probably share that opinion. I know, like, I personally feel very squeamish about the way animals are treated in, especially in the United States, but around the world. So, I think those are very, very fair concerns. The main point that I wanted to raise is that, generally speaking, the treatment of animals that are involved in these kinds of rituals in Afro-Caribbean communities are treated infinitely, infinitely more humanely than in the typical American slaughterhouse, especially animals that are factory farmed. We're talking about animals that are raised in very, very different kinds of environments most of the time. They're killed in people's homes by people who, this is something that they've learned how to do. And a lot of the time afterwards, the animals are eaten. They're cooked, they're prepared, they're eaten by the family, etc. A portion will be left for the spirits. Etc. So I think a lot of Americans, especially, I'm speaking as an American, I don't have a whole lot of exposure or a whole lot of experience with these sorts of issues in other countries. But in the United States, I think a lot of us have this idea that animal sacrifice, and a lot of this has to do with sort of media sensationalism. Sensationalism. That's not a word. I'm going to stop trying to say that. Sensationalizing? Crap. Okay, anyway, it has a lot to do with how things get hyped up in newspapers and movies and, YouTube and the internet and whatever. I think we have these ideas that voodoo animal sacrifices, unwashed people in their Brooklyn apartments with their dull knives and blood everywhere and strange symbols on the walls, and like that's really just not the case. And that's not what this original video was saying. I wanted to throw it out there that the the sorts of conditions that we're talking about for animals that are raised for this kind of purpose or purchased for this kind of purpose are usually vastly different than what's going on in your typical factory farm in the United States. I'm not saying that that means that you have to think it's okay. I think that's important. Especially because, I mean, plenty of pagans aren't vegetarians, and like these are the same sorts of people who say that, you know, they object to animal sacrifice because they're, you know, they've got some sort of ethical issue. Well, if you have an ethical issue with something like animal sacrifice, then maybe you should have an ethical issue with factory farming too. Like, it's not necessarily a judgment call on anyone. It's just, I mean, if we really want to be ethically consistent, I don't know. I'm not a vegetarian. You know, I don't know. Anyway, I wanted to throw that point out. The second, and I think more important point, has to do with this idea of the necessity of animal sacrifice and the necessity of sacrifice in general, but I'm going to focus on, I think I'm going to do a separate video entirely on sacrifice and this concept of sacrifice in the pagan community, but specifically animal sacrifice. And there are a couple of things that go on here. Mainly, what happens is people refer to something like the charge of the goddess. And they'll say something like, I'm speaking very, very generally here because I see this frequently, and I imagine a lot of you have too. They'll make some comment about how, well, you know, the goddess doesn't demand sacrifice of us, basically. And people talk about, you know, like, oh, well, Wiccans don't practice animal sacrifice, or neo-pagans don't practice animal sacrifice, and blah, blah, blah. And first of all, those things aren't true. Like, they're just not. Sorry. But there are some historical problems with the charge of the goddess anyway, in terms of versions of it, and where it first appears, and when it first appears, etc., etc. But regardless of all of that, the charge of the goddess is not the literal word of the gods. Like, it's just not. I mean, it's an artistic creation by a person reflecting their personal encounters with a specific goddess, frankly. And then it gets used by subsequent groups, and it turns into this sort of this archetypal goddess who she's simultaneously all goddesses, and, well, she doesn't demand sacrifice. And if that's your opinion, then that's fine. Like, absolutely. If that's been your experience with the divine, then more power to you. But to then turn around and tell other groups that, well, the gods don't demand sacrifice, sacrifice isn't necessary, that's really not fair. I just think it's a denial of other people's encounter with the divine. And I've found over time that my experience, I've said before that I'm what you could call a hard polytheist, meaning that I see the gods as being very, very distinct entities. I'm not an archetypist at all. I don't subscribe to the idea of a god or goddess that is simultaneously all gods and goddesses. Again, that's its own video and its own sort of heated opinion from me. But Annika Garrett posted a comment on this video that I'm responding to, and she said something like, this is what I see as the difference between ancient paganism and neo-paganism. The modern versions are somewhat sanitized. And I'm gonna back her up on that one, just because, I mean, historically, animal sacrifice is a big part of not just pagan traditions. I mean, Jews and Christians practiced sacrifice too. And I mean, never mind, I'm not going there. But some gods do demand sacrifice. And many, you see that in Afro-Caribbean traditions, voodoo, Santeria, etc., for a reason. Like, I mean, so to say that it's not necessary, I think is very, it shows a very, I think, limited experience of maybe paganism or religion more widely. And I don't say that to be a jerk, but what it shows is a specific kind of experience with the divine, which is an experience that's respectable, but it's not the only experience, and it's not even by any means a majority experience. some gods demand animal sacrifice. Like that's just how it is. And I think that over time, I don't like to think of it as whitewashing. Annika called it sterilization or sanitization, rather sterilization, sanitization. And I think that's a fair way of putting it. I mean, I think I say we collectively because I've done this too, and I see this all over the place. I think we've kind of neutralized a lot of these gods and turned them into something that's very like socially acceptable. Oliver is licking my plate. Something that's very acceptable by our own standards. And because as an American, I might find something like animal sacrifice distasteful. Therefore, my interpretation of these ancient gods is going to be that they don't require it of me. And my experience with the gods has been that that's not necessarily the case. A lot of the times, they don't care who you are or where you're coming from. They like what they like, they demand what they demand, and that's how it is. So, anyway, I wanted to throw out those couple of points. First, about the animal rights issue, and then second, this idea about whether or not something like animal sacrifice is necessary, and whether or not how you feel about that has a lot to say about your experience with the gods and what you think the nature of the gods is. And for me, gods are individual entities, and to whitewash and say that the goddess doesn't demand sacrifice. Well, maybe Doreen Valiente's goddess doesn't demand sacrifice, and maybe your goddess doesn't demand sacrifice, and that's fine. But that's certainly not true across the board. So, anyway, that's all. Hope this was coherent. And I'm going to go and feed Oliver because he's eating off of my plate.